So with that, then we've got our first speaker, Stuart Smyth from the University of Saskatchewan. Again, you can self-identify and tell people why you're relevant, and then get on with the day. Thanks a lot, Stuart.
Thanks, Tyler.
Yeah.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out this morning. So, I think one of the important things that I want to try to get across is Canada's uniquely situated right now to have a tremendous opportunity to capitalize on the blunder that Europe made last summer when they announced, when they announced that they were going to treat genome editing as equivalent to transgenic technology. Within 3 months, you started to see news stories coming out of the press in Europe that not only were the big multinationals already starting to move investment resources out of Europe, but also the small and medium ag technology players were doing the same thing. So that capital is going to move somewhere. And I would love to see it move to Canada to create jobs here, new products, but also to advantage our grad students, to provide more opportunities or new opportunities for training for them. So what I want to do is to provide a bit of a global overview on sort of where genome editing is at in terms of our major ag competitive countries, but also to give you a sort of a bit of a state as to where Canada's at in terms of some of the scientific perspectives on genome editing. I have an industrial research chair at the University of Saskatchewan, and these are the partners that fund my program of research, and I want to acknowledge and thank them for their generosity. So globally then, from a GM perspective, at least this is sort of a benchmark that you can look back to, there's been over 60 countries that have approved GM crops at some point in the last 25 years. Since the start of the first regulations on approvals for GM tomato in the US in '92, there's over 4,000 approvals. And you can see the different crop varieties and crop types. Not a single one of those 4,000 risk assessments has come back with a legitimate environmental or human health concern as to why those technologies should not be commercialized. So this is probably one of the most globally regulated technologies in the history of innovation, certainly in agriculture. And there's not been a single case that's come forward to say this technology should not move forward to commercialization. Yet, it's still, from a regulatory perspective, dealt with in a very harsh manner. And so you can see in the last bullet, based on the ISAAA data that from 2017, we're down to 24 countries, but the number of farmers growing this is still very high. So in terms of the Canadian perspective then, based on a review of the decision documents from the CFIA, there are 2 gene-edited varieties that have been approved for production in Canada. I can find no evidence that the BASF variety has ever reached a point of commercialization, so it may have been simply a test case by BASF to put it through to the system to get a perspective on how it was going to work. It could also mean that in the transition and the recent round of mergers that this technology sort of got stranded as it moved through the merger process. Cibus did have canola in Western Canada last year. I've not been able to find out how many acres they had, but they have been marketing it as a non-GM canola. And the CFIA and Health Canada have not pushed back against those claims. The Canola Council of Canada has not pushed back against those claims, and based on what I'm seeing and talking to the industry is that this canola variety has been successfully taken up by the farmers in Western Canada. So one of the things we did last year was we undertook a survey of plant breeders in Canada to get their perspectives on genome editing and the regulatory framework around that. So there's we identified a little over 400 plant breeders in Canada. So we got about 22 or 23% of them to respond to our survey, and you can see some of the numbers up there, and they concern me greatly. You can see that 40% have had proposals turned down because they believed the variety was going to be a PNT. They're not pursuing research because they perceived it was going to be a PNT. A third have experienced delays. So let me tell you, at our university, at the University of Saskatchewan, we have an unwritten rule that we will not develop a PNT. Because to do that, we need a parallel system. That we would need a separate phytotron, we need separate greenhouses, we need separate land for field trials. We don't have that money, nor the capacity to be able to do that. So our university will not develop a variety that could be treated as a PNT. So we're missing out. We can't use a lot of the new technologies. Certainly, and in my talking to the breeders over the last sort of 12 or 18 months, they're using CRISPR and these other technologies in their labs to do proof of concept, and then going back and using chemical and radiation mutagenesis to get as close as they possibly can to the CRISPR variety, but not using the gene editing technologies that are so time-saving and cost-reducing, but going back and using the method from 70 and 80 years ago because they won't be treated as PNTs. I'll just sort of briefly share one story. I was talking to one of our breeders, and she had developed a variety that had they discovered it had a 20% yield bump. And she knew automatically that that would be treated as a PNT. So she's now completed 3 years of trying to increase yields by 5% per year, so that by the end of 2019, she will now have a variety that has a 20% yield bump, but nobody's had access to it. We've added a 4-year delay in getting that variety to market. So I think our regulations are adding a considerable burden to innovation in the ag sector. You can see a third have altered breeding objectives to try to get this. 14% are saying they're not proceeding. So the takeaway message from this is that our PNT regulations are starting to be viewed as a barrier to innovative investment in Canada. And that really concerns me, that if that's the mindset at the plant breeder level, and there's this tremendous opportunity as investment capital's fleeing Europe, are companies looking to make innovative investments looking favorably at Canada? Certainly if their plant breeders are involved in that decision-making process, what I've just shown you as the results from this survey over the last 2 slides, that would tell me that the image of Canada as an innovative, friendly country, we've got a lot of work to do, at least from a regulatory perspective, and convincing the government that precision and precise genome editing technologies are not to be regulated as PNTs, or that's going to slow our regulatory process down. The States, I would argue, is considerably further ahead of us. 3 years ago, Penn State put through a non-browning button mushroom, and the USDA said this does not require regulation. That was clarified then last spring by the Secretary of Agriculture, saying that as long as there was no additional or foreign DNA and it wasn't a plant pest, then it would require no further regulatory oversight. The EPA has been trying to treat genome-edited livestock, particularly dairy cows, to be hornless, as trying to regulate them as a drug, and they've had a lot of pushback from the science and academic industries in the US. The FDA is a voluntary process, so at this point, any technology developed would not be required to go through the FDA, but certainly the USDA declaring that this is just conventional plant breeding gives companies that are working in North America a tremendous advantage to make sure that those investments go into the US and not come into Canada. And I have heard from a couple of firms that do work on both sides of the border, and they're already starting to indicate that their companies are targeting more investment resources to the US than they are to Canada. and plan to do that over the next few years. So in terms of some of our major producing competitors, Argentina and Brazil are certainly high up there in terms of their ability to be as productive as Canada. Argentina's got a system that's science-based, but what they've come out and done is essentially what the Americans have done, is said as long as there's no transgenes or foreign DNA in the product that gets put forward for variety approval, then it's going to be regulated as a conventional plant variety and not require any additional regulatory oversight. Brazil has said we're going to do the same thing, and so have Paraguay and Uruguay. So the four of the biggest GM producing countries in South America have all said if there's no transgenic material in the variety going forward to market, it will not require any regulatory oversight. I was talking to one of the Embrapa officials from Brazil last fall, and he said due to the GM technologies, they're starting to get 3 crops per year on some of their fields. So you think about the tremendous advantage that Brazil's starting to gain in terms of crop production on us. And if we're starting, if Canada slows our approval system down in any way, shape, or form, I get really worried that a lot of the investment is going to go to variety development in Brazil or in Argentina rather than coming to variety development in Canada. So in terms of what's going on in Australia, about a year and a half ago, their technology regulator proposed to look at amendments to genome editing, or pardon me, to genomic regulation in Australia. They put out a position paper, and it was a bit of a mix, saying that if there was no transgenes present, it would not be regulated as a GMO. However, from their food safety perspective, it differs from the gene regulation. So you can see there's two technologies, SDN2 and ODM are being regulated as GM equivalent technologies by the OGTR, but from a food regulatory perspective, they're being treated as conventional plant breeding. Now, Australia and New Zealand were to have, by the end of 2018, have dealt with this revision, and this process is still in play. They still have not come to a final decision as to what this regulatory or revised regulatory framework is actually going to look like. So at this point in time, I can't give you a definitive answer, but certainly I would say that Australia is slightly ahead of us because they've at least engaged in the process of reviewing their regulations around plant breeding technologies. When we move on to Asia then, China's been heavily involved in this, and there's a couple of review papers that have come out in 2018 showing 4 different crop varieties, 7 different traits, and over 20 different varieties have actually entered into the approval system. Now, with the debacle that China had in October with the announcement of the twins being born through genome editing technology, I think this has sent a message not only internally within China but globally that the regulatory system in China is just in utter chaos. They have no ability to have any type of oversight or control on genome editing in China. I don't know where this is going to go, but given the command and control system that they've got there, I would not be optimistic that there is going to be much advancement in terms of genome editing in China until they get this resolved and they've got some confidence in their scientific capacity. Considerably more favorable in Japan. Last year, their Ministry of the Environment struck a committee to look at how to treat genome editing. Now, Japan has not approved any GM crop for commercial production in Japan, but they certainly import an awful lot of them from countries around the world. And so what this committee of experts did is they looked at all of the targeted genome breeding, and they came back and they recommended to the federal government that, as long as there's no foreign DNA in any of the varieties that are in the market, these would not require any additional regulatory oversight by the Japanese government when it comes to consideration for import. So Europe has always been an outlier, and again, it'll come as no surprise that they certainly are in this case. Since EFSA was established, over 15 years ago, their system has managed to approve a single GM variety. Now, this was a variety of GM potato, the Amphora potato that BASF had put forward in 1990. When it was approved, BASF said, we're not going to commercialize this. The technology's so old, no one's going to adopt it. And what the European system has done is EFSA is responsible for the risk assessment process, and they've consistently delivered decisions identical to what Canada, the States, Australia, Brazil, Argentina, all the other GM adopting countries have done. So from a scientific risk assessment perspective, they're consistent with us. But in how they've split their approval process. So EFSA does all the risk assessment, and then the European Commission does the variety approval. And in that system, every EU member gets to vote on whether that variety gets approved, and in the EU system, they need a 2/3 approval to get any variety approved for commercial production. And so I've talked to people that are involved in these committees. The Scandinavian countries are predominantly strongly in favor of commercializing these, but there's so much political opposition in other parts of Europe that they can never get that majority they need to commercialize any of the varieties. So they've got a politically gridlocked system where they will never be able to commercialize any of these new varieties within the EU system. And Sweden actually went so far as in 2015, their domestic regulator for these technologies looked at a variety that was being developed at one of their universities there and said, yeah, you know what, this is not transgenic or GM technology. This is just simply digital biology, an extension of conventional plant breeding, and said that from a Swedish regulatory perspective, the university could go ahead and start field trials. There was no additional regulatory oversight required. And so then when the environmental groups started to pick up on this, 9 of them in France filed a petition to the French government 3 years ago saying that, no, all of these new genome editing technologies were identical to transgenic GM technologies, and therefore they needed to be regulated by the European regulations that govern GMO technology. So the French federal court refused to even rule on this, and they punted it up to the Court of Justice of the European Union that ruled last July that all of these new genome editing technologies, regardless of whether there's foreign genetic material or not, would need to be regulated as the equivalent of GMOs. And as I said when I opened, capital has been flowing out of Europe since August. In the mid-90s, Europe accounted for 1/3 of the global ag R&D investment. By 2015, that had dropped to under 9%. By my calculations, Europe's lost something like $20 billion over the last 2 decades because they've turned their back on innovative agriculture research. Where's that money going to flow? Well, it's certainly been flowing to Canada and the States, Argentina, Brazil. You talk to anybody in the ag sector, they know where these investments are flowing. But my concern starts to become, is Canada going to be viewed as a receptive market for these investments if companies are looking, certainly from the plant scientists, they're saying that Canada cannot at this point be viewed as supportive of innovative investments given the structure of our PNT regulations. You might not have seen this. I just picked this up on Tuesday. UNEP just came out with a report listing the top 5 environmental concerns, and their #1 global concern is genome editing, synthetic biology. I managed to read that on the plane down. Unfortunately, there's some positive material in there, but I think the second bullet really gets to the heart of this, and the message that comes out is that these technologies could lead to the extinction of species. And this point is played up. And oddly enough, there are a lot of references, but there was not a single reference for that sentence. So they're speculating again as to what might happen down the road. What they want to see and what the report ultimately calls for then is a rigorous enforcement of the precautionary principle. That unless the science or the scientists can guarantee that there will be zero risk for the environment, for human health, these technologies should not be allowed out of a laboratory. Which becomes tremendously concerning because there's no ability for anybody in society to guarantee zero risk with anything. So why would we start to apply that to science now in the dawn of the 21st century when we've never applied it to science in the last 350 years? They failed in a lot of the literature that they do cite in there, they fail to provide examples of where the technology has been proven, where it is working. They certainly don't mention any of the technologies that have been approved in Canada and the United States that have been commercialized. So I think from an environmental NGO perspective, this is an issue that they're becoming very focused on now, that they want to try to push this issue as saying in the public and the minds of politicians that genome editing is just another name for GMOs. You can't trust it, they're not safe, they're dangerous, they cause cancer, and the whole litany of other things. And this is going to be the political push that comes out of the environmental movement. We had hoped to be able to invite Trevor Charles from Waterloo to talk. Trevor's at a meeting in Europe. So Trevor's actually been kind enough to provide me with a couple of slides. So if you have questions on these slides, I'll declare right now I won't really be able to answer them, but I'm happy to sort of record the questions and transfer them on to Trevor so you can get an intelligent answer back. But what Trevor's concern is that there's going to be a tremendous opportunity in terms of bioinoculants. And the way these technologies are being presently regulated in Canada, specifically in that pathogens have to be identified, yet neither the CFIA or the Health Canada is willing to identify which pathogens are important to the decision-making process, means then that the firm has to sort of use a shotgun approach as to which pathogens they think might be the appropriate ones to do the risk assessment on, to gather all that data, to submit it to the CFIA without any certainty that that is the data that the CFIA is going to want. So what Trevor's saying is that there's going to be a huge opportunity because in the States, bioinoculants really don't require any regulatory oversight. And as the plant microbiome research starts to develop, our university's just starting to get into that with a large CFREF project. There's going to be tremendous opportunities over the next decade in the development of bioinoculants. And unless the CFIA and Health Canada establish very clear guidelines as to what research needs to be done from a risk assessment process, his concern certainly in the bioinoculant space is that the innovation investments are simply not going to flow into Canada. I wanted to share a slide with you. Some of you I know in this room are involved in this ongoing series of surveys that we do around genome editing regulation. This is one that came out of a survey that was part of one of the surveys we did in 2018. So those are the list of barriers that our expert panel of just over 400 people, and I think that we had about 130 or 140 people respond to this question. Do you notice the top 6 concerns that we've highlighted there? Not one of them is science-based. Those are all regulatory and political issues. So what our experts have been telling us in this series of surveys is that the science is sound. The science is getting through the regulatory systems. It's safe. It's good for the environment. There's no human health impacts. Those are not issues. Where the system is grinding to a halt is in the regulatory side of things. And you can see the lack of international standards, asynchronous approvals, consumer acceptance, all of number one, the political interference in the regulatory systems. This is where our regulatory system is starting to grind to a halt. And in talking to some people in the room this morning before we got started, I'm hearing those same stories here, that the CFIA and Health Canada are making regulatory decisions, but from a federal government perspective, they don't want to be seen as being the first ones to allow a new genome-edited variety into the marketplace. And the political reality is that our federal government's in some hot water for some other things, and with an election in October, it's hard to imagine how politically they would want to move forward on allowing genome-edited products into the marketplace in 2019, because they certainly don't want any more adverse media attention or environmental attention to come to them in the next 6 months leading up to the election. So I get really concerned that 2019 may be a lost year in Canada in terms of our ability to do much in the way of any innovation. So just to quickly wrap up, virtually all of our key competitive countries in terms of egg production have moved to adopt what the states have said, that if there's no transgenic material, the variety does not require any additional regulatory oversight or anything that would equate it to being treated from a regulatory perspective as a GMO technology. So most of our crop producing competitors are already at a significant advantage to Canada. Capital's been flowing out of Europe now for 8 months since their Court of Justice decided that genome editing is the equivalent of GM technology. So my concern becomes that if we want to capture some of this capital that's flowing, it's imperative that our regulatory system provide that international message that we are a home to innovative agricultural research, and that regulations are not going to be a barrier to commercializing the technology when it comes to genome editing. And unless that message starts to roll out in 2019, I get very worried that so much of the capital that is going to leave Europe and has been leaving will have all left, and that by 2020 there's not going to be much capital left to leave Europe, because it's already going to be reallocated somewhere. So I think it's very important that from a regulatory perspective, Canada step up very quickly and make the statement that no, genome editing, as long as there's no transgenic material, is not going to require any additional PNT regulatory oversight. These will be treated as conventional varieties. The variety recommending committees for all of the commodity organizations can deal with them the same as they do with all of the chemical and radiation mutagenesis technologies that are producing varieties right now that the CFIA doesn't do a full risk assessment on. So thank you for your time and attention, and I think we've got a few minutes for some questions.